these good things about the proclamation of the gospel. That's what Paul's writing about. He's writing to these believers there in Corinth whose thinking is fuzzy. Their perceptions are clouded, and so they're being distracted into lesser, at best, lesser things. At worst, of course, they're in real, serious danger. They're being distracted to things that had been taught to them, some things they had experienced, and these spiritual gifts and so forth. He commends them at the beginning. No one excelled in these spiritual gifts beyond them. And yet, their focus, their emphasis was skewed. That is, it was on the wrong syllable, and so they ended up speaking the wrong words and the wrong things to one another. I meant to say syllable, didn't I? For you younger ones, syllable. See, if you get the emphasis wrong, it comes out wrong. So the apostles then, like in most of his letters, he's having to clarify these things, bring them back again to the things that had been preached to them, these things that they had believed, and which they're in danger of forsaking for something else. It may be just a little bit at first, just a little error, like, Brother Levi he used to be a framer, and you get that frame on the front of that building off just 1/8 of an inch on one end. Well, how much is it going to be off 50 feet away? It's going to be way off. I remember a fellow that did some build on a garage for us in Carl Junction years ago, and he bragged to me that when they got done, that if I remember correctly, it was about 18 or 19 feet wide, and from the point where he added on to the corner of the roof that he had added on, it was only off 1/8 of an inch. Well, that was pretty good. Yeah. That's pretty square. Mm-hmm. Pretty square. Well, he could brag about that being off just 1/8 of an inch. But of course, with the things of God, you can't be off. This is why we must have God's own righteousness, because ours is as filthy rags in his sight. And he's the one, by the agency of his Son, who's the judge of all judgment's been committed to the Son. By his agency, he's the one who's going to do the examining, on the last great day. So, when you think about these things then, that the apostle writes here to these believers, a wisdom not of this world, or the princes of the world, the wisdom of God, in a mystery, even hidden wisdom. Hidden wisdom. How do you discover that? Well, you yield yourself to God and you let him reveal it. To put it plainly, you let him reveal it to us, and that's what he's done. That's what this record is all about. In the preaching of this message in the book of Acts, it was introduced, of course, in seed form by the Lord himself, but it wasn't expounded. It wasn't set out there because he had to finish it, didn't he? He had to finish the work here in the earth where sin had been committed. We spoke about this morning. He had to be made a man, came here, offer himself as a man for men to resolve this matter of sin. Then once that was resolved, then this wisdom could be preached and made known. But then even after it's preached in the book of Acts, it has to be further expounded and enlarged. For what? For understanding. Remember there in Ephesians 1, Colossians 1, Philippians 1. Those prayers of the apostle there for the believers, for their increase and their expanded understanding of these things that they had believed, that they had been preached to. Now, this wasn't just Paul filling in the spaces of a letter, a newsy letter, that was written to the churches about how he was doing and how things were going and what he needed. Not at all. Not at all. It was for their increase. Needed, necessary, increase, progress forward. Now the basis of that, of course, the foundation of that, I mentioned that text this morning in our Bible study. The foundation of that from Isaiah 28, a costly cornerstone, a firm foundation, was a man.
Amen.
This is a message about a man. He was more than just a man, but from our perspective, he's a man. We're men who need to be saved. He's a man who is a Savior. So this is then this hidden wisdom of God. We live in a generation, last 2 or 3 generations especially, probably the last 2 generations, my father's generation and his brothers who all went to war. You remember the name of the book, The Greatest Generation? Saved the world. Boy, saved the world. They sure did. We think we can save ourselves from whatever comes up. Of course, the context of that is not God. It's politics. It's socioeconomics. That's what we can save ourselves. See, they don't have a clue that they're going to meet God. What then? What are the politics when you meet God? What of social dilemmas, matters and issues between people when you meet God?
Amen.
What about money in the bank and investments and the bankers and debt and taxes when you meet God?
Yeah.
See, none of that's going to be there.
Amen.
Nobody's going to be talking about that on that day, are they?
No.
Yeah. Nobody. That's why we have this picture there in what we call Revelation 5 of the throne room of God. And what's at the center? We know who's at the center. It's not what, it's who is at the center, isn't it?
Amen.
It's this mystery of God. The one whom at first the Apostle John didn't even recognize him at first. And he fell before him like a dead man. And he reached forth his hand and said, "Don't be afraid. I have the keys of death and Hades. I was dead, but I am alive forevermore. I am the first and the last, the Alpha and the Omega, the beginning and the end." Now, those of us familiar with Scripture know that that's language that God used about himself,
Amen.
isn't it? It was the Lamb. That's who's at the center of the throne. That's who's going to be at the center of all things on that day. And repeatedly, in this revelation of John, the inhabitants of heaven reference this sacrifice, don't they? This one who laid down his life, who paid the price, who gave himself a ransom for many. They repeatedly reference that. Now, none of the princes of the world knew this. They're the ones who crucified him as a criminal. They thought he's just a common criminal. He's just another Jew, just another crazy preacher from the countryside, a Galilean of all things. He didn't even have an education. But as I said this morning, his enemies knew what he was saying, didn't they? That's why there in John 8 and John 10, they picked up stones to stone him. His childhood friends in Nazareth knew what he was saying that day when he read from the prophet Isaiah, didn't he? That's why they drug him down the street and were going to throw him off the cliff. They knew what he was saying. They just weren't going to accept it.
Amen.
So those who were religiously trained, the Jewish nation, the Hebrews, they knew what he said, but the majority of them said, "No, can't be. It can't be. God would not. No, God would not. Not our God." Well, we all know that was true. Not their God, huh? But the God of heaven was not their God. That's the point. And of course, the princes of the world, they just didn't have a clue. They just tried to wash their hands of the whole thing, so to speak, huh? One did literally. Tried to wash his hands of this whole thing. And those are just the historical events. These are not the exposition. This is what Paul's writing about, the exposition of these things, how it's set out there so everyone can see it, right out here on the table so everybody can see it. If you're willing. See, now the exhortation is be willing to see these things. Because many of us know that in the religious world, if you cleave to this truth, you will preach something different than what's being preached in the pulpits today.
Yeah.
And you will have to make a decision.
Amen.
Several of us have had to. We've had to make that decision. Regardless of education, background, some of us have been lightly exposed to these things from an academic institutional perspective. Some of us have a lot. But we've had to forsake that institution in order to cling to, remain faithful to the preaching of this wisdom. And of course, we're not welcome in those pulpits, and we know it. We're not welcome. I've had an experience where a brother who spoke up for me years ago, spoke up for me in a gathering of several dozen preachers, spoke up for me and commended me. I had no clue that was going to be said. Most of those guys there didn't know me. Spoke up and said some very nice things about me during a prayer session with a whole bunch of preachers. And then the last time I saw this brother would not speak to me, just a few years ago, because of this. Because I was no longer an institution man.
Amen.
And he knew it. So he had nothing to do with me. Sat just down the table, a couple of chairs. Didn't speak to me when he came in, didn't speak to me when he left. Because I said something in that meeting that made it pretty clear that there was a distinction. There was a distinction about thinking, see?
Yeah.
About wisdom. So, as we continue forward then, in this truth, it's a very large truth, isn't it? The exhortation is to faithfulness. Don't allow yourself to be distracted to lesser things, even lesser things, much less things, wisdom of the world, even lesser religious things. Don't allow yourself to be. Keep your focus. Keep clear. And you've got to hear, I've learned in the last 20 years, you've got to hear this yourself. You've got to be preached to yourself in order to keep this. If you're among a people whom, even if you're doing the preaching, if you're among people, you get no response,
Yeah.
there's no reciprocity, as we say, you're not going to grow. You're going to be just thoroughly frustrated
Amen.
at every turn. If there's and it's got to be a lot of exchange. It's got to be for you to be, especially for some of us. Maybe not so much for maybe some others. Likely some others can have just some, but there's got to be exchange. Some of us need a lot more, a whole lot more. It's hard. This is the thing that's hard to measure. So faithfulness is the exhortation. Faithfulness to this truth that God has ordained before the world to our glory. We're not talking about church growth here.
Amen.
We're talking about the last day and the ages to come. That's what we're really talking about. That's what's at stake, brethren, in faithfulness to this gospel, which is the power of God unto salvation. Thank you, brother. You, brethren, have some comments, Brother Jeremy?